Good morning, everyone. Happy Monday morning to you. My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma, and this is what I call my morning musings. We are looking at Paul's doctrine of the resurrection in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. I don't have to tell you that 99.9% of all believers think that Paul is talking about the raising of biologically dead bodies out of the dirt at the end of the current Christian age. Well, I've been sharing with you how that is untenable. We are now focused on Paul's statement, after studying the concept that the resurrection would be when the law, that was the strength of sin, i.e. the law of Moses, would be abolished, taken out of the way, removed and overcome. But Paul also says that the resurrection would be when the sting of death, which is sin, would be overcome. Simply stated, what Paul is saying is that when sin would be dealt with, death would be dealt with. Paul is dealing in 1 Corinthians 15 with the death of Adam. Well, God said, Genesis chapter 2, 15 to 17, to Adam and Eve, "Of every fruit, of every tree that is in the garden, you may freely eat. But of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you will not eat thereof, because in the day you eat, you will surely die." The question, of course, is often discussed, what death was God talking about? Was he talking about biological death? Well, they didn't die biologically that day. That is undeniable. It is simply indisputable. And by the way, God did not say you will become mortal that day. God did not say you will begin to die that day. God said, in the day you eat, you will surely die. Now, I want to urge you to go to my website, donkpreston.com, do a search for Dallas Burdett, read his article in which, as a teacher of Hebrew, he linguistically examines Genesis chapter 2 to show and to demonstrate and prove that God was telling them very emphatically and undeniably they would die that very day. Not 1,000 years later, not hundreds of years later. They would die that day. Now, building on that, all right, what I want to do is I want to begin an examination. I've already shared with you a couple of Old Testament passages which demonstrate that the death, that is the focus of resurrection, the narrative is sin, death, resurrection. So what I want to do is to begin to show from Pauline theology his doctrine of sin, death, resurrection. And to do that, I'm going to focus on Romans 5 through 8. And the reason I'm going to do this, pardon me, is that Paul's discussion of sin, of Adam, sin, and death, versus Christ, righteousness, and life, permeates, it's what Romans 5 through 8 is all about. And in some ways, Paul's discussion of Adam, sin, and death fleshes out and gives us more detail, gives us even more insight into 1 Corinthians chapter 15. Now look, I'm unaware of anyone that just denies any connection between Romans 5 through Romans 8 and with 1 Corinthians chapter 15. So you need to know that. When we will discuss, therefore, Adam, sin, and death in Romans 5, we're talking about 1 Corinthians chapter 15, where Paul says, "As in Adam all men die, even so all shall be made alive." Well, Romans chapter 5, "Wherefore as by one man sin entered the world, and death through sin, therefore death passed upon all men." But then he goes into a discussion, "As by the one man's offense death reigned through sin, even by the free gift of God's grace, righteousness and life should reign." See? So we are absolutely dealing with the exact same precise themes, motif, and subject. Now, here I am. I've already taken up a lot of time, but I want us to focus and to show where right here in Romans chapter 5, where Paul is discussing Adam, sin, and death, that he is absolutely not talking about biological, physical death. Now, if Paul, in discussing Adam, sin, and death, by one man, sin entered the world, and death through sin, because that's the garden. Adam and Eve sinned, death entered. So, when we talk about Romans chapter 5, Adam, sin, and death, we're talking about the garden. We're talking about the death that entered the day Adam and Eve sinned. Whatever death Paul is talking about in Romans chapter 5 is the Adamic death of Genesis. It is the Adamic death to be overcome in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. Now, I'm saying all of this as preliminary, as setting the context for our examination of Romans chapter 5 through 8. We cannot lose sight of the fact that Paul is focused like a laser on the death introduced by Adam the day he sinned. Thus, if it can be proven, if it is the case that the death that Paul is focused on in Romans chapter 5 through 8 is not biological death, it therefore follows that the death of Adam, the death that Adam introduced when he sinned, the death to be overcome at the resurrection of 1 Corinthians 15, is therefore not biological death. And I have to say this. I believe the evidence is absolutely overwhelming and irrefutable that Paul in Romans chapters 5 through 8 is not concerned in any sense with biological death that is the result of sin. I believe that we can prove that in such a way to show that the historical view of Adam, sin, and death versus the righteousness of Christ and the gift of God, which is eternal life, is absolutely unrelated to biological death. And not only that, that the historical view of the church absolutely negates the power and the reality of forgiveness. It denies that the believer today is under the power of life. It denies that the believer today will never die. It says the most faithful believer in Jesus Christ and His righteousness remains under the curse of Adam. What? How could I say that? Well, we're going to be developing that as we proceed. Today's video, once again, is simply to set the stage for our upcoming study of Romans 5 through 8. Now, a little bit of a heads up here, all right? This is going to be a very, very short week. I'll only have today's video and tomorrow's video because my wife has to go back to the cancer treatment center to have some follow-up tests. No, there's no indication of any return of cancer. This is regularly scheduled follow-up consultation, follow-up test. We're not concerned at all, but, it just simply takes time. So again, we'll have today's video and tomorrow's video in order for me to take my wife back for her testing. Well, thank you so much for joining me for this morning's Morning Musings. In the meantime, do not forget, you need to get yourself a copy of this book, The Last Enemy and the Triumph of Christ by Daniel Rogers. It's so easy reading, very, very easy to understand. And if you go to my website, donkpreston.com or BibleProphecy.com, and you order the book, okay, make sure to mention in a note that you saw the offer on YouTube or Facebook. I will include 100% free of charge, Preterism, A Brief Introduction by Brian Martin. Excellent, excellent introduction to the truth of covenant eschatology. So order yourself a copy of that excellent little book by Daniel Rogers. You'll be very, very glad you did. In the meantime, we will see you on the flip side.